And so when we look at this for this particular category, the emphasis is on empowerment and individual rights for people with disabilities. So the ADA encourages covered entities to focus on the abilities for people with disabilities. Also encourages and encourage employers to look at people with disabilities as a valued part of the workforce. Also, state and local government leaders to see people with disabilities as a contributing members of the community and rather than a social burden. And lastly, places of public accommodation, such as stores, theaters, dry cleaners, and so on, to see people with disabilities as a potential customer rather than objects of pity. Our second objective for the ADA is remove segregation and isolation. So this providing telecommunication relay services for people who are have hearing impairments. Also removing architectural barriers. So that means putting in ramps so people can access the building that they choose to go into. And also requiring reasonable accommodations in an employment setting. So that means if a potential employee or an already existing employee, that a reasonable accommodation can be extra breaks or an assistive technology device that will help them do their essential job. And thirdly, the objective that the ADA address is provide accommodation. So this will be covered entities. The covered entities have to provide accommodations, reasonable accommodations, and that's in all the covered entities. Reasonable changes to policies and programs. So if that will allow people with disabilities to participate in program services in regards to policy and procedure, but not actually taken away of the policy and procedures itself, its structure. And lastly, provide auxiliary aids and services. So auxiliary aids are interpreters, so sign language interpreters, or as we have on our call today, Spanish interpretation. So those are auxiliary aids, and also includes alternative formats. So if a person with a disability need Braille or need an audio or large print, that's auxiliary aids as well. So today we're gonna go to an overview of two of the titles of the ADA. And the first title we're going to do is Title II, and Title II is the state and local government. And the state and local government agencies and entities are also called public entities. So Title II for state and local governments. So the ADA covers the programs and services operated by state and local governments. The Title II of the ADA mandates that no qualified individuals with a disability shall, on the basis of disability, be excluded from participating in or be denied the benefits of the services, programs, and activities of the public entity, or by subjecting to discrimination by any public entity. So Title II says, hey, there is no excuse why you shouldn't provide services with people with disabilities. You can't deny a person because of their disability. You can't deny them access to a building because of their disability. So this is, or the services that's provided for state and local agencies and entities. So Title II requirements for these are very important. So the public entities that fall under the Title II have these specific requirements. So the entities may not refuse to allow a person with a disability to participate in a service program, may not establish requirements that tend to screen out individuals with disabilities, such as regarding a driver's license. And this is one of the issues that might come up. So we know that there is two types of identification. So you got people with driver's licenses, you have people who have state ID. So the screening out, you can't allow as your policy of a program to only require people with a driver's license. So as for instance, as myself, I have a visual impairment. So I have never driven. So if I was wanting to participate in a program that the state or local government provides, and this is included if you're going to school, if you're going to a state programs ran by the state, they cannot require me to have a driver's license. So there's screening people with disabilities who cannot get a driver's license because of their disability. So an entity cannot screen a person because they have a disability based on, if they need to have a driver's license or not. So that is against the law. So we want to make sure that these are, that people know about these requirements. I'm sorry, some of the other requirements that's dealing with equal opportunity, effective communication. And so when I was talking about before, an entity cannot deny a person effective communication. So if a blind or visually impaired person or hard of hearing person need alternative formats, like a hearing impaired might need a visual access to policies and procedures or access to that program. A visually impaired person might need Braille or large print to access a service or program. So all of these are requirements under the Title II state and local government. Title II of the ADA covers, sorry, lost my space. Any type of local government agency, any department of agency of state and local government contains commuter authorities and Amtrak. So this is what Title II covers. And I want to just say that these state and local government or programs are entities that receive federal funds, and those agencies, programs, or services that do not receive federal funds. So any, just for instance, like independent living centers, we do have federal funds. So as an entity under Title II, that we cannot discriminate people with disabilities. Of course, we are a disability service organization, but there's other agencies and organizations out there that are receiving federal funds. So all the requirements that was listed on the previous slides cannot be, not attend to the people with disabilities. So even if you don't receive federal funds as a state or local government or public entity, that you must still comply with the requirements of Title II, including, as I listed before, commuter authorities and Amtrak. So Title I, the two major Title II, the two major categories of programs and services. So the first one is those interviewing general public contact as part of ongoing operations of the entity, and those administered by the entity for program beneficiaries and participants. So the first category activity includes communication with the public, such as telephone contacts, office walk-ins or interviews, and the public use of the entity's facility. And the second category activity includes programs that provide state and local government services or benefits such as health, education, and recreation programs, welfare, and unemployment benefits. So all of those are the activities that are those public services, those programs and services cover in Title II. So Title II, state and local government licensing. So Title II also covers the public entity that covers those licensing provisions for people with disabilities. So that's including certifications and regulatory activities. So there's no discriminations in those particular processes. So if a person is, if a public entity requiring a license, then that person with the disabilities is protected. As long as they meet the requirements for licensing, then that entity cannot discriminate against them because they have a disability, and they have to provide the accommodations that will allow that person with a disability to participate in that licensing process. So we're gonna stop here for questions for Title II, state and local government. So if we have any questions.
Yes, I know. Thank you so much, LaKenya. We do have one question that has come through the chat, and then we'll go ahead and open it up to any other questions many of you may have at this moment. So the question was, and I know they mentioned schools and employers. So schools, I would think, come under that first Title II, since they're usually state and locally funded agencies. Employers maybe is in this next section, but maybe we can start hinting to it already anyway. And the question is that sometimes, schools or employers or such may claim undue financial burden to try to not provide an accommodation. So if it is felt that this is really just kind of an excuse to disguise discrimination, shall we say, how does someone advocate in those situations, or who do they go to?
Okay, so great question. And that is mostly for Title I, but since I love that question so much, because a lot of people have, what do I do when an entity, an employer or whoever say that, hey, I have an undue hardship or a burden to not give you that accommodation. So one thing, they usually tend to stay there, but how you advocate is, one, they got to provide adequate and substantial reason for that burden. And then the only way you can do that is to file a claim. So if you're actually in the workforce or at a school, there are different agencies. The Department of Education, I believe, is the agency that will cover if you're an employee for a school. And so you can file a claim because that entity has to prove that there is an undue burden. And this is what a lot of people feel, that, oh, well, that's it, that's all. No, it's a thing called the interactive process. So if an entity claims that it's going to be an undue burden for me to do this reasonable accommodation, that means I can't, as an employer, stop there. That means I have to continue with the conversation with the employee to come up with the solution for that barrier. So they can't just stop there. So in order for you to advocate first, you need to put in a claim with the Department of Education if you're working in a school, to get that entity to say, hey, this is the reason why it's an undue burden for me, because this is not in our budget, or whatever their claim is. And then that enforcer, which is the Department of Education, and other, there's a lot of them that falls under different categories. And so they will determine, hey, well, it looks like that you can afford this based on your budget. So they got to prove that it's an undue burden. At the same time, if they say, and if that entity, if that agency, the governing agency says, hey, it is an undue burden for them, but they can't just sweep you under the rug, that employer has to say, hey, well, let's come up with another alternative. Let's come up with another solution to that barrier. So they just can't sit you and just throw you away, or not come up with anything to help you do your job. So that's an answer in a nutshell. Title I really covers the whole thing about the interactive process in employment and things of that nature. But of course, if you're in schools and things of that nature, the governing entity that enforced that particular thing would be different, of course, because the EEOC and the Department of Education and all other entities. But you can't stop there. So you have to make sure you advocate and communicate with your employer and say, hey, but I wonder, is there another way? And sometimes you can make suggestions. That's that interactive process. You still have to communicate. That employer still have to communicate with you, because the whole purpose is to get rid of the barrier that is in front of you.
That is great. I am really going to, I'm writing that down, interactive process. I think that's that's really kind of enlightened me on that subject a lot, because I had just guessing here, that if it truly is an excuse to cover up discrimination, it's not going through the process. They're just trying to get you out of their office or sweep it under the rug or exactly. Whatever it is. But if you're actually, going down the process, whether it is, the filing the claim, finding other alternatives or whatever it may be, then that probably will make it very obvious pretty quick whether or not it truly is just covering up discrimination, or whether it's a legitimate burden, right? So
exactly.
I love that. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions? And I believe that last question was from Tina. So Tina, if you have any add-ons, hopefully you feel that question was well covered. But if not, please go ahead and either continue to chat or unmute yourself and jump in here. Okay, we'll just give one more moment, and if anybody has any questions they want to jump in with, otherwise we'll continue on learning about Title III.
Oh, right. So Title III, and this is where a lot of people get confused, because even me, when I first started learning, Title II, public accommodation. And when you see public, you think it's the public entities, but Title II is the public entities, and Title III is the private entities. So that's the it can be kind of confusing in that sense when you see public, but it means the private entities. So the public accommodations are private entities, as I stated, that own, operate, lease to places of public accommodation. Places of public accommodation include, but not limited to, restaurants, hotels, theaters, convention centers, retail stores, shopping centers, dry cleaning, laundromats, pharmacies, doctors' offices, hospitals, museums, libraries, parks, zoos, amusement park, anything that we go into in our community, that's a public accommodation. Those entities that provide goods and services to the community. So Title III covers private entities, those entities that I stated, commercial facilities, and these are non-residential facilities, including office buildings, factories, and warehouses, whose operations affect commerce. And lastly, private entities offering certain examinations and course-related to educational and occupational education. So those entities that fit, like I mentioned, in Title III, that that requires certification and things of that nature, also are covered in Title III. So the non-discrimination, hold on, the obligations, I'm sorry, my slides got messed up on my iPad. So the obligations under Title II, and I'm gonna quickly just turn my camera off so I can actually read it. So these are the obligations that's under Title III. So the first one is operate in a non-discriminatory manner, ensuring individuals with disability have the same opportunity to participate in and benefit from the services, activities, and goods offering as all other customers, patrons, and clients. So the obligations for these entities should make sure that they don't discriminate and give the opportunity that a person with a disabilities have the same benefit for. The obligation number 2 is to ensure that communication with individuals with disability is as effective as with others, including providing auxiliary aids and services when necessary to eliminate communication barriers. This is super, super important, like I stated before. So effective communication is very, very important in all entities. So as they provide services, activities, programs to the public, that effective communication is always there and always open. So that those auxiliary aids that I discussed before. So if someone right now is Spanish speaking on our call, or a Spanish speaking that come into your place of business that need interpretation, that you are obligated under Title III to provide that auxiliary aid. If someone is hard of hearing, you're obligated under Title III to provide that auxiliary aid of a sign language interpreter. Like I stated before, alternative formats are very, very important for people who can't read the standard of materials. So that's large print, braille, audio cassettes, for people who have various different impairments. So it's very important that the communication is effective for people with disabilities as they get service. So So these accessibility or provides accessibility by removing barriers in existing facilities where removal of barriers is readily achievable. Readily achievable means that the barrier removal can be accomplished with little difficulty or expense in relations to the resources of the entity. So that barrier removal, for instance, a person cannot access a building, a public entity. So that barrier removal, that readily achievable, will be putting a ramp if that building doesn't have a ramp for people who uses a wheelchair. So it's achievable, and to be perfectly honest, it's obligated for a building to have a ramp. Like I stated before, that's access to a building that others who don't have a disability have access to. So that if it's achievable without any expense and stuff like that, that facility, that entity must provide that accessibility. Obligations under Title II, and this is how we will continue. So providing alternatives to barrier removal when modifications to remove barriers are not readily achievable. Providing accessibility in all renovations or additions to facilities and constructions of new facility by complying with the ADA standard of accessible design. So this is so important. The ADA standards is 2010. So these are the standards that facilities must adhere to. And so those for existing buildings, for new constructions, those entities have to make sure that they abide by the ADA regulations for access for people with disabilities. And I'll have the actual link to the ADA standards in the later slide and the checklist. Or here we go. So the accessibility requirements for Title II and Title III. So these accessibility requires, as I mentioned, one is the standard, the ADA standard for 2010 is the across the board standard for Title I and Title II. So you want to entities that are needing to comply with the ADA will have that guideline to make sure that their facility is accessible for people with disabilities. Also, the checklist for existing facilities, it's a really good resource, not only for architects or building owners, but also for people with disabilities. It's a big thick if you print it out, and it's a lot of information, but sometimes when you're empowered to know what is required to buildings that you need to access, you tend to look at buildings like, okay, well, this is not wide enough for my wheelchair. So these are the standards that need to be implemented in this facility. Well, this facility doesn't have a ramp. These are the specs for a ramp in order for me as a person in a wheelchair or a person with a stroller or a walker can access this building. So it's not only for builders to have this checklist, it's good for people with disabilities in the community to have this checklist as well. And of course, the standard of accessibility is very detailed in what the standards are in buildings that provide public accommodations to the community.
No questions have come in the chat as of late. So anybody from in attendance today, please feel free to unmute yourself or go ahead and put any questions into the chat, as well as any comments or experiences that you think maybe would help to highlight our conversation today, or help to maybe get at some of the day-to-day realities that we all face out there that maybe we fall under this somewhere, that I'm sure, LaKenya, you can help enlighten us about.
Mm-hmm.
And then correct me if I'm wrong, LaKenya, or I think this kind of gets to what you're talking about also, Cheryl. In the environments that we have more advocacy over than the environments that we have more control over, like when you're building homes or even where you're providing service facilities, things like that. I know just through experiences that I've had being part of that process, that sometimes these standards, so it would be great if they're updated, are like the minimal standards,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so you
Mm-hmm.
really kind of have to think about it from, you have to have, I try to think of it as like accessible comfort versus just minimum accessibility, because I've even seen things, well, this is accessible. And it's like, yeah, but if I used a wheelchair and I use this spot, I'd have to like leave every time anyone wants to go in and out of here. So yes,
Exactly.
technically it has the, the clearance space that's required, but that doesn't mean it's functional for
Right.
people with, and
Right.
so there's definitely a big difference between like, yes, I'm meeting standards, which thank goodness,
Yeah.
because that's a right. Like everybody has to at least be able to go there, but that doesn't
Mhm.
mean it's going to be a comfortable environment, depending on what sort of environment is needed for that, right? And so really
Yes.
have to kind of think bigger when we can and advocate for that. So I don't know if you can
Exactly. And
bounce off that, LaKenya.
yes, and it's housing or I always say if a entity or a facility comes and say, okay, hey, I'm just gonna, what should I do? I always say go above and beyond the standards,
Mhm.
because you to me you're gonna reach more people, and that's when universal design come in. And it's a pretty hard thing when an entity, a facility just say, hey, I'm just going to do the minimum just to get that get over the hump in compliance. But I always say go above and beyond, just like parking spaces, like accessible parking. There's a minimum of accessible parking to a building, but a lot of builders, or owners, whatever, say, hey, let's go above, let's put more accessible parking in our parking lot. So that's how I see it, because then the barrier can just go dwindle down and down and down, and the access can just go up and up and up if you go beyond the minimal requirements. That's just my take on it. And if I always say, if someone say, hey, just gonna do the standards, and I'm like, well, you can go above. You can go above and be above the standards, if it'll make life so much better, and then more people will be able to access.
Yeah, absolutely. One more question did come in through the chat, that they had heard that historical buildings are not necessarily included in needing to meet these standards. Do you have any more information on that?
Not exactly, I don't, but if under Title 2 and Title 3, because if the historical building becomes a museum, and the and that museum is open to the public, then that museum have to be accessible. If the historical museum, I mean, if the historical building is just a building, and someone in that private entity, or whoever owns that building, is not using it for public use, then no, under
Interesting.
Title 2 and Title 3. But if and sometimes it happens where historical buildings become museum, then that means that you're providing services to the public, so that it needs to be accessible.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you for that. I see Goldie, welcome. I'm glad you're here. You have a question?
Yes. What would be, what if you're going to a public building, public service building, but the building is rented, but the property needs a ramp? How do you go about that?
Okay, so in our next slide, we're going to talk about that particular, the whole of the answers. So who's responsible for accessibility? So both a landlord who leases space in a building to a tenant and the tenant who operates a place of public accommodation have the responsibilities under the ADA. Both the landlord and the tenant have full responsibilities for complying with all requirements applicable to places of public accommodation.
Okay.
So,
Oh.
yeah, go ahead.
With that understanding, though, ADA is a blessing, but it's a law. There's no enforcement right now, and that's the hardest thing about the ADA is enforcing it. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm getting to is, how can we best self-empower ourselves? Because the organization, they provide us information to help in self-empowerment and help us navigate through situations because you don't represent. How can we, like, if we talk to a building and we know that nothing's going to change, like you say go up the chain, how do you find out what a next chain is and when you're dealing with a public entity?
Yes, so the public entity for title, the enforcer, the enforcement entity for Title 3 is the DOJ. So if you come to, in your scenario, Goldie, and you need to advocate and empower yourself, the enforcer for Title 3, you making a claim to the DOJ. And what I would advise, I really, really, really want people to know that the DOJ is, of course, one of the biggest government entity there is. And sometimes it can get hard because I had to help someone in a very, circumstance with local programs, and she felt that she was discriminated against because of her disability. And so we had to make a claim through DOJ because the entity itself wasn't working, telling, hey, I under the law, this, and that, and they wasn't trying to hear it. So you have to go, make a claim to DOJ. DOJ sometimes can be a little, the process can be a little long, and sometimes people getting discouraged, but I say, don't get discouraged. Don't get discouraged. If you make a claim with DOJ, you put as much detailed information, because the form gives you an opportunity to describe exactly what's going on. Much detailed information as possible. And if you want to, I would suggest to make claim of where that violation is in regards to the ADA, you can find that out, and I'll have resources for you to find out. If you already know, I will say, hey, this violates Title 3 in this particular area. And so that's the DOJ can investigate that particular claim. Goldie, you're totally right about the ADA not being enforced in the way it's to go, because of course we have different enforcers, agency enforcers in the different titles. But what I would suggest is not just stand there and just say, hey, oh, well, but to first address the situation with the building owner. Hey, such and such and such, this is a violation of ADA because blah, 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 blah. If that person doesn't listen, then you say, well, I'm going to have to file a claim with the Department of Justice. And sometimes I've known a lot of people who get lawyers.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the response. I have a 1 o'clock meeting to go to. I enjoyed the presentation. Thank you
Thanks,
very
Cody.
much. All right.
Just to reiterate Goldie's question, if at any point where just for instance, a management company leases a space to a boutique or somebody who's going to provide public accommodations to the public, then both of those parties have an obligation for accessibility. The management company, however, falls under a different title. The boutique, that person who's providing services, goods, and services to the public falls under Title III. So they both have responsibilities to make that store, that boutique, that whatever that you're selling accessible to people with disabilities. I'm gonna go. If you have any questions with the ADA. So the ADA resources, the ADA National Network, it's a great resource for you to get a lot of information on the ADA, trainings, other resources, a lot that your questions, if it comes up later, that they can help you with. There is regions, ADA centers throughout the United States. Is kind of divided up into regions. I think we're region 9 in California, I believe. But the ADA National Network is a great tool for people who can go and get more information. You can do a little bit of training about the ADA. Pacific ADA is a really good place to start to ask like some questions. I've used Pacific ADA just to kind of understand, hey, I got a consumer who says this about discrimination, this is what she's going through, and they can literally look up specific subtitles and stuff in the ADA to find that, hey, her or his rights are being violated or they're being discriminated against, and this is the specific law. They can do that for you right over the phone. Also, the website have a tremendous amount of resources as well. So I implore anyone who have questions, because the ADA is so big, it's so complex, and different situations come up that might be a little bit complex, that you might have questions about, then these resources, especially the Pacific ADA, you can just call them up and say, hey, this is my question. And my rights being violated as a person with a disability, and they can guide you to next steps as well. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. In a nutshell, I like I said, this is just an overview. I mean, you can really go into depth with Title II and Title III. Title I is employment, and that's really a hot topic too. That I think people should look into as well, because it gives you the whole processes as an applicant to an employee.
Excellent. If you don't have to rush off anywhere, LaKenya, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and launch the poll, because some people may need to leave now. But if you do have any other burning questions or what have you, we can stick around for just a couple more minutes here to try to get all of those questions answered. And don't forget, that's why the Disability Thrive Initiative has the support center. So you can reach out to us that way. You can email us, you can give us a call, and we'll try to get you connected either with LaKenya herself or with whatever resources, it might be some of those embedded within the slides that you shared today to help get your questions answered, because this is so important. And I saw a quote once that when it comes to accessibility, that I think is so important, and that's that it's not charity, it's rights, and it needs to happen. And all of us are the ones on the ground level here who, if we can inform ourselves and educate ourselves, we can really make a difference out there through advocacy. So thank you so much, LaKenya. I really, really appreciate all of your time today and this really informative presentation. And I can just tell we have even more questions coming in and people requesting the PowerPoint and things like that. So
I'll email it to you.
Excellent. So I know a lot of people there's a lot of takeaways today that I think is really going to empower the community. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you for having me.